Chapter 1. Delwyn froze. Trapped inside her own body, she was paralysed as hypnopompia seized control. Loud bells rang in her ears. Her eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling, where 3 alien beings were staring back at her. The 2 on the outside looked like average greys, but the one in the middle was different. It was white and larger, with a face that floated in front of its head like a milky mirage. Delwyn tried to scream, but as usual she couldn't move her lips. The scream bounced around inside her like an angry echo, and she thought she heard the one in the middle say, "Not yet." Then they vanished. Now she could move, so she rolled out of the bed, finally able to scream, but stifling it, as she didn't want to wake the other residents. It was morning, and she had spent her last night in the psych ward at Tarwood Hospital. She stumbled to the bathroom and jumped in the shower, hoping that the water would drown out her sobbing. She tried not to care, as she was leaving. Her torment was finally over, and she was going to stay with her Auntie Gwen in the country. It had been 2 months since she had been committed by her ex-husband and her mother, after a prolonged foray into madness that had ended in the flash of a psychotic break. Suffering from narcolepsy, in particular hypnopompic and hypnagogic hallucinations, didn't help matters. She didn't dare tell anyone about her astral travelling and other mental splintering. The cat was already out of the bag. She'd let her marriage dissolve out of resentment for having been talked into it in the first place. When her mother berated her and her husband turned his back on her, she withdrew into her own world, which had always been the way she dealt with problems. She knew that at 30 years of age she should have had her act together, but her comfort zones were located in other dimensions. After she shook off the episode, trying not to rationalise it too much or brand it as a psychic attack, she dressed in her favourite black velvet dress and red boots. She quickly brushed her long black hair and then rushed around repacking her bags and double-checking that she had all of her journals. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Boyd, was coming down the hallway as she checked the train schedule on the computer for the 100th time. The heels clicking on the floor made Delwyn wince as they reminded her of her mother, Nancy. Dr. Boyd was very much like Delwyn's mother. She was well dressed, clinical and to the point, painfully thin but blonde, whereas her mother was brunette and dyed her hair pitch black to match her heart. Delwyn was sure of that. She was also pretty sure that Dr. Boyd had a good heart, as she had shown concern for her predicament. As the doctor walked into the room, Delwyn looked over and forced out a smile, although she didn't want to be kept any longer than necessary. She could tell that Dr. Boyd knew something had happened and that she was trying to be careful with the framing of her questions. "So, did you get enough sleep?" Delwyn nodded. "Yep." "How's the medication treating you?" "Fine," Delwyn lied. She was fully dosed and it made her feel like she was cocooned in fluff and dipped in sleeping potion. She started fussing about her luggage to send a hint, but the doctor ignored it and obviously decided to jump right in with the issue she'd been trying to discuss since Delwyn arrived. "Delwyn, I just don't understand why you won't tell me about the episodes you had as a child. It would help me so much with the therapy and my understanding of your situation." Delwyn walked over and pulled up in front of the older woman, who was a little too much like her mother. She had warmth, but shared it sparingly, as though the patients had to earn the scraps here and there. However, Delwyn was no performing monkey, and did not want to be one of her fascinating subjects in some silly memoir. Before she answered, she checked the train schedule she'd printed out and stuffed it into her handbag. "You understand enough to know that I have narcolepsy and that my parents were horrible. My marriage is over and I'm recovering from a psychotic break. I'm grateful to you and the psych unit, but I'm going to my aunt's farm to recuperate and get back on my feet. That's all you need to know, isn't it? So you can file me away as cured." She went back and started grabbing her bags and suitcases as Dr. Boyd sighed and stared at her like a parent watching a petulant child. Delwyn didn't want to tell her about the spaceman who used to visit her when she was 3 years old and how he would waft her blankets up and down. She didn't want to talk about the witch who would appear at the end of 100 beds in her room, even though there was only one bed. She would never tell anyone about the jelly man who would come into her room and drag her off into the ether, trying to absorb her into his body. Delwyn believed that some secrets were meant to stay in the shadows. It was obvious to Delwyn that Dr. Boyd disliked not knowing all the history of her afflictions. When Delwyn was a child, the adults had laughed and scoffed at her, telling her that she was having nightmares and to go back to sleep. After her parents' divorce when she was 5, her mother started telling her that the episodes were real. It was because she was naughty and that monsters were going to take her away if she didn't do what she was told. If it hadn't been for her Auntie Gwen, who periodically looked after her when it was all too much for her mother, there was no telling what would have happened to her. Gwen had tried to set Delwyn straight and continued saying that they were indeed nightmares and mental problems that the doctors could fix one day. They never did though, no matter how much experimenting with medication, therapy or testing. Delwyn just had to learn to live with it, and everyone thought that she was just special. Not that it was technically called narcolepsy, but it was under that umbrella, and Delwyn had become accustomed to calling them her turns or episodes. She preferred the word narcolepsy, though. It had a nobler connotation than hypnopompic hallucinations. Through her late teens and 20s, her friends had said that she was lucky that she didn't have to take drugs to trip. After a while, she stopped getting angry and trying to explain it to them. She just kept it to herself. When she took days off from work, she told her employers that she suffered from depression. Now she was 30 years of age and made to feel that she had to explain herself yet again, and she wasn't having it. She did one last check, thanked Dr. Boyd, and then went off to catch her train. The doctor yelled out, "I'll be in touch, Delwyn. Keep taking your medication." Later, Delwyn stood on the windy platform of Spencer Street Station, flanked by raggedy luggage with her long black hair lashing about her blank face. It was an overcast Melbourne morning, and she waited patiently for the 9:05 train to Gippsland that would take her to Magpie Meadows, the dairy farm run by her Auntie Gwen. There she would find respite from the tornadoes and tidal waves still echoing in the caverns of her splintered mind. Having been given the thumbs up from her doctor and with the divorce finalised, the gate was open. She had sold most of her share of the furniture and the rest had already been sent to her aunts, along with the boxes of books and forgotten relics. It had all been for the best, considering her mental state and her husband's nonchalance as what to do with her until her mother had intervened. She contemplated all this as the train rolled in, squinting her hazel eyes at the flood of noise and movement. The hissing of the train and loud voice over the PA system made her wince as the medication polarised her senses, yet numbed her at the same time. Even though she was considered fine to travel alone, she didn't feel well enough. She didn't feel that she could be trusted. Although what she couldn't be trusted with or for eluded her. It wasn't as though she wished herself or anyone else harm. Even Duncan, her ex-husband, had been reduced to a pinprick in her awareness. By the same token, it wasn't as though she didn't care, but what she did care for, she didn't know. She did know, however, that she wanted to escape to Magpie Meadows. Safety and warmth waited for her there. Auntie Gwen's kind words and quiet strength would shore her up and smooth away the wrinkles that had gathered in her wretched heart. When the train pulled to a stop, she waited to be waved aboard and started piling her bags onto herself like she was a pack mule. Then she grabbed the 2 beaten suitcases, hoisted herself up onto the train and lurched towards her carriage. When she found it, she stowed her luggage and plopped heavily into the seat, plugging in her earphones so she wouldn't have to talk to anyone. Years ago, she'd been far more likely to want to make new friends. Now she viewed people as insects, swarming towards her in order to consume her, cell by cell. She knew this thought was irrational, but she went along with it anyway. for the sake of peace. After they pulled out of the station, she stared out of the window in a trance as the Melburnian cityscape rushed by in a blur. Her feline eyes weren't fixed on anything in particular. She just stared out into the distance as the city morphed into the outer suburbs, which then melded into industrial sites and in turn seamlessly blended into the rural landscape. She craved peace, and Gwen's farm was the magical faraway place that had the right feel for what she needed. Delwyn's relatives had said that Gwen was strange and a recluse, moving to the country with Uncle Sean to start a new life away from family and friends. Delwyn remembered nothing but kindness and goodness from them, although Uncle Sean had passed away some years ago. Yes, they had been eccentric, if you considered that to mean private and down to earth, but they lived simply and had no hang-ups. Gwen had always been patient with her, and that's what she needed now. As the train drew closer to the city of Sale, she could feel the atmosphere change. The landscape became simpler and quieter and seemed unfettered by consumerism and pollution. The air was sweeter and time seemed to slow down, as though they'd slipped into a realm where previous concerns ceased to matter. Delwyn could feel her senses come alive, just like they had when she was younger. The excitement in her belly took over the gnawing and aching emptiness that had made a home there, which was such a relief. She opened the window, peering out to see the familiar trees, such as the banksias, pittosporums, grevilleas, eucalyptus and cypress. Even though she could see the old mixed with the new, the charm of the country town was still there. The train slowed and the brakes hissed as it pulled into the station, and passengers slowly rose from their seats and stretched. No one was in any particular hurry, not like in the city. It was as though they had teleported into a different dimension, which suited Delwyn just fine. It's what she had hoped for. She stepped off the train, following the other passengers as they meandered, one by one, onto the sun-drenched platform. As she walked along towards the car park, she could see her aunt leaning against the old green Land Rover, with her large-brimmed straw hat hiding most of her face, her arms crossed in her pale yellow cardigan. She was wearing her sensible khaki pants and Birkenstock sandals. She waved a little wave when Delwyn got closer and went around the back to open the door for the luggage. Delwyn appreciated that there was no pomp and circumstance, no questions or disappointed shake of the head. As she put her seatbelt on, her aunt squeezed her upper arm as a gesture of welcome. She was usually quite understated with her emotions, but never cold. They drove on in silence through the streets of Sale, down Prince's Highway, past the Catholic College, watching the pretty ancient trees, shop fronts and unassuming homes, until the road stretched into the country via Sale Maffra Road. Delwyn grew more and more excited the further they drove away from civilization. As they drew closer to the farm, she realised that at 30, most women her age would have been mortified to be cut off from their friends and the city life. But this was all part of her plan, to create a whole new life away from the nightmare she was leaving behind. She wanted to slip into another skin and start living as someone else. It was her second chance. As the Land Rover turned into the long, winding driveway of Magpie Meadows, that private feeling came over her. It was like stepping through a portal to a faraway place. She felt like she was leaving her old self behind. She spun around in her seat to watch the road disappear behind them, like a child watching the past dissipate, half expecting to see her old self vanishing into the landscape. As she turned back, she saw the familiar dirt road snaking through the old, gnarled Monterey cypress trees. She loved the secret feeling she got when travelling through this dark magic tunnel, and especially loved when it cleared to reveal the quaint little college nestled in the middle of the dark woods. The dairy sheds, also surrounded by cypress trees, were situated further back, behind the main house. Dougie and Sue's, Gwen's two blue heelers came running at the car, barking excitedly. When Delwyn was younger, she was afraid of the dogs, but now she loved their boisterousness. She leapt out of the car and they jumped all over her, greedy for cuddles and pats, sniffing and whimpering their greetings. She clutched at their dense fur and rubbed their ears, squeezing and hugging. Gwen growled at them, "Ease down." Delwyn defended them. "Oh, they're okay." She let them lick and nuzzle her face. Once the hellos were over, they started hauling the luggage inside. There was an old picket fence around the house, painted the palest blue, which was peeling and had vines attempting to take over. As they stepped through the front gate, it creaked gently and they continued along the pathway, past the sweet little patch of vegetables that contained silver beet, carrots, tomatoes and potatoes. On the other side was the Maya lemon tree, which had yielded fruit for countless pitchers of lemonade that they'd made together over the years. The path led to the screened porch, where Peter, the ginger cat, was sleeping on an old chewed-up wicker chair. Delwyn rubbed behind his ears and he didn't open his eyes, but stretched out his neck in ecstasy. Gwen unlocked the front door and swung it open, standing aside to allow Delwyn space to carry the luggage inside. As she entered into the kitchen, she deeply inhaled the homey scents that hinted at Lux soap, bacon, wood from the old-fashioned stove, coffee, freshly cut Daphne flowers in the vase on the dining table, and many other lovely forgotten smells that congealed into a heady mix of happiness. She plopped down at the table, watching her aunt light the stove to put the kettle on for tea. "Put your things in the spare room, where you used to stay when you came for holidays." Delwyn smiled and said, "Thanks, Auntie Gwen. I'm really grateful for everything you're doing for me." "Don't mention it, love." Gwen took out the big black cake tin from the larder and placed it gently on the old wooden table. She smiled warmly with her eyes. "How about some cake with your tea?" Delwyn smiled and nodded. She loved her aunt's language, her voice and her movements. Everything about the way she existed was slow, soft and deliberate, wise and completely without panic or anxiety. Everything she did and said evoked peace and tranquility. Nothing was ever rushed or spur of the moment. She was like the trees, rocks and mountains. She was 53 and had long black hair once, like Delwyn, but now it had streaks of silver along the front, which made her seem exotic. She swept it up into a bun and had large green eyes. Delwyn's mother, Nancy, had always been jealous of her sister-in-law, being quite a stunning woman and different in every way. There was nothing mean about Gwen, whereas Nancy was cold, calculating and bitter. Delwyn had always wondered what had happened to make her so nasty, but neither her mother nor her aunt would discuss it. Gwen took the lid off the cake tin and cut 2 thick slices of her homemade dark fruit cake. She slid the pieces onto the plates and passed one to Delwyn along with the fork. Then she took the kettle off the stove and poured the boiling water into the teapot slowly and carefully, and placed the lid on it, covered it with an old red tea cosy and brought it over to the table. She said in her firm yet gentle voice, "Let it steep for a bit, love." They sat quietly, eating their cake for a minute or two. Then Delwyn heard Gwen take in a deep breath. She leaned back in her chair, studying Delwyn's face for a short time, then spoke. "All right, sweetie, just a few rules, okay?" Delwyn nodded. "Okay." "You're a good girl, so I know you won't be much trouble." They smiled at each other and laughed. "I'll be good, Auntie Gwen, I promise." Delwyn meant it. She would behave. Also, Gwen knew that she would, but she could never be too careful, seeing as there was something in Delwyn akin to her own spirit from another time when Gwen was a different person herself. Delwyn understood that Gwen was the type of person you obeyed simply out of respect for her character, which denoted gravity and solemnity. There was no escaping that. Gwen took the cosy and lid off the teapot and stirred the contents, then replaced the lid and poured their tea. As she handed the milk jug to Delwyn, she said, "I just wanted to say that we don't have to talk about your mum or Duncan until you're ready, okay?" Delwyn fought back tears and swallowed the lump in her throat, which was already doing battle with the piece of cake she just ate. She was surprised at the tears, so ready to flow at the mention of the two people who'd hurt her the most, but also who she had carefully hid in the recesses of her subconscious. She struggled to respond, which made her aunt hop up and come around to her side of the table. She finally spluttered, "That's fine, Auntie Gwen, thanks." Out of breath, she added, "I nearly choked on my cake." Gwen laughed softly and rubbed her back for just a moment, letting her know that she understood without crowding her. She went back to her chair and sat down, taking a sip of her tea, studying Delwyn's face, which was returning to normal. She obviously could see that Delwyn had already programmed herself to flatline. She knew that it would take time and patience for the pain of the divorce to morph into proper healing and acceptance. She also knew that now wasn't the time to talk about the nightmares or sleep paralysis that were becoming more frequent. She would wait to see how they would eventuate after settling in. She wondered about Delwyn being so lost, so pretty and intelligent, but such a dreamer. They discussed the sharing of cooking and other chores, and that after Delwyn had settled in, they would find her a therapist close to town. Delwyn made a face, but Gwen held firm. "That was one of the conditions, girlie. You need to get through all this and get back on your feet." I know, I will, I promise. I just hate all that psychobabble horse shit." She knew that she sounded like a spoilt teenager, but resigned herself to the fact that a deal was a deal. Gwen studied her for a moment, as though searching for any sign that would indicate betrayal, but she knew that this was the end of the line for Delwyn, who was no fool, after all was said and done. "Okay, love, good." They continued discussing the arrangement. There was no internet, so if Delwyn wanted to use it, she'd have to go next door, which was 40 acres away, to the Eversons' farm, now run by Greg, the youngest son. He also helped out at Magpie Meadows when Gwen needed it. The older son, Mark, was quiet and reserved, and had moved out to run a farm of his own, but also helped out here and there. They were pleasant enough and had been happy to play and share whenever Delwyn had been on holiday in years past, although Greg was the one she'd played with the most. Mark was always dark and brooding. She was to be careful, as usual, when wandering around the farm, and as always, certain buildings were out of bounds for safety and other reasons. After tea, Delwyn went into her room to unpack. It was off the kitchen and quite large, as it used to be a sitting room. She closed the door behind her and looked around. Not much had changed since she had stayed the last time, 11 years ago at 19 years of age. Apart from a few more books stacked on the dresser and a new bed, it was the same dark room that gave her that mysterious feeling. When she was a young girl, she imagined the shadows coming to life as they flickered through the glass double doors at night. The room opened to a covered veranda, with steps down into the herb garden in the back of the cottage, which was bordered by banksia and eucalyptus. She could open the windows and smell the lavender, rosemary and thyme wafting in. The garden was surrounded by the old picket fence, and the gravel road ran alongside it, lined by more Monterey cypress trees. She loved the secretive atmosphere of Magpie Meadows and the magical house. On the wall opposite the big bed was the fireplace, full of books and newspapers, and to the left of it stood the ancient desk, also stacked with books, old gardening magazines, and even more newspapers. It had always been funny to Delwyn that the bookcase standing on the right side of the fireplace was the only one in the room with the least amount of books in it. For some reason it wasn't so strange now. It contained a few forgotten pairs of shoes, an old atlas, some maps, a few small statues, some boxes and jars here and there, a dried flower arrangement, and a doll that had been accidentally burned on a barbecue one summer. The carpet was old and grey, but scrupulously vacuumed. The walls were a pale mustard, and the curtains were richly brown and out of place as they were new. The bed and blankets were also new, so they too stood out, brown and white and too crisp for the dreamlike aura of the room. What had always given Delwyn the willies was the taxidermy case in the corner, quite large and stuffed with a wide variety of birds, including seagulls and sparrows. Even though she'd always loved sparrows, this collection unnerved her, and had done so since she was small. The eyes seemed to follow her, and she always felt as though they would spill out and peck her to death when she wasn't looking. She dragged her suitcases to the desk and hurled them under it, and then dropped the rest of her bags on the floor. Opening the curtains to let the last of the afternoon sun in, she noticed the faint odour of lavender, dust, and aging books hit her nostrils. It comforted her just as much as the sight of the familiar garden and veranda, with the old cane chairs and wicker table. Delwyn stood at the door, holding the stiff curtains open, eyes closed, and remembering the times she'd snuggled under the covers, listening to the crackling of the fire and the creaking of the old cypress. For a brief moment she felt ashamed with herself for having lost it, for hiding away like a spider, and escaping to her aunt's farm to retreat from the prying and whispering that waited for her in civilization. Her aunt had been kind in her offer of a home. Delwyn had dreamed of her opening her big camel coat like a great big bird opening her giant wings, and she had swooped into the comforting darkness as those wings enfolded her. The shame was also about being 30 years of age and feeling like she was back at square one, after having gone through a divorce, losing her job, and losing face with friends and family, even though her isolation was self-induced. She thought back to one of her last sessions with her psychiatrist, Dr. Boyd, who had reminded her not to get swept up in her fantasies of what had happened, and to remember to keep checking the reality journal for reference. The reality journal, the blue one, was the one where the supposed truth was being recorded, and was only allowed to be used in conjunction with her sessions, and only after having been proofread by Dr. Boyd. She was allowed to record her dark or angry thoughts in the black journal, her hopes and dreams for the future in her white journal, and finally her sexual or forbidden desires in the red journal. She had wanted to have another journal for her astral travels, dreams, and hypnagogic experiences, like a grey or silver journal, but Dr. Boyd insisted that they were too likely to encourage indulgence in escapism, and that she wasn't ready to keep her own dream journal. Rather, the dreams she discussed with the doctor were kept in her desk, which could have annoyed Delwyn more had she not been so heavily medicated. However, she was finally free of Dr. Boyd's clutches, and she secretly decided that it was time to begin her own journals. As she put her clothes away, she heard a magpie warbling in the garden. She opened the doors and stepped onto the patio, watching it on the fence, talking to no one in particular. She said, "Hello, Maggie." It stopped and turned its head quizzically at her, then flew to the railing of the herb garden to get a closer look. It was only about 4 feet away, and she said hello again. It started warbling as though introducing itself. They chatted to each other for ages. She couldn't remember the last time she experienced such a sense of peace and contentment.